Hello, you are about to listen to another awesome episode of the If I Had One Wish podcast. It's such a pleasure to bring you these meaningful conversations from friends and allies across the Wish network. If you aren't part of the network already, do you know you can join? Either as an individual or a corporate member, you'll get access to all the wonderful things we offer here at Wish and play your part in championing women in our sector. Follow the link in the show notes to find out more, but for now, enjoy the conversation. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the If I Had One Wish podcast, the podcast where we talk to inspiring change makers in the social housing sector and beyond. This is our Here Come the Boys series, where we talk to our male allies about all things gender equity as part of my See Her presidential campaign. I'm your host, Crystal Hicks, and today we're joined by someone on a mission to level the playing field in social housing, Richard Blakeway, the Chief Executive of the Housing Ombudsman. Richard, thanks so much for being here.
Crystal, it's an absolute delight. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So it's great to have you on this series called Here Come the Boys, and it's all focused around the role of men in the sector and the role that men can really play in making the social housing sector more equitable. You know, there are so many ways, aren't there, that can be done, sort of advocacy and allyship. So really excited about getting into that today. But Richard, your leadership at the Ombudsman is really driving impact to make sure that tenants' voices are heard and that they really matter in decision making. So today I was hoping, it's all right with you, that we could explore sort of male allyship in action and how men are, and I suppose potentially could in the future, tackle gender inequality both in the housing sector and within their organisations. So if it's all right with you, we'll just dive in, yeah?
Brilliant. Go for it.
Super. All right. So to begin with, could you briefly explain the remit and core mission of the Housing Ombudsman? So tell us about how it helps the sector serve our tenants and how, if possible, that intersects with issues of gender equity.
Yeah, fantastic. Of course, Crystal, and I absolutely take the strong hint there about briefly explain. It's not a user-friendly term. It's not the kind of, it doesn't say, the name on the tin doesn't really explain what's inside it. So an ombudsman's really designed to address imbalances of power. And I think that's really at the heart of what we do. Injustice, fairness, these are the kind of values that drive the organisation. And that's the way we're designed. That's the purpose we're designed for. And I think there's probably, I would say, three legs. I would describe it as three legs to the stool. So one is the thing that people know most, will be most familiar with, which is individual dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution, an alternative to the courts, a free to access alternative to the courts. Second bit, if something's gone wrong, print it right. We're not an advocate for the landlord, we're not an advocate for the tenant, but we are an advocate for fairness. So we are neutral there and we put things right where they've gone wrong. The second leg of the stool is what I think is kind of preventative. I see it as our kind of preventative work, genuinely learning from complaints. I am such a believer that complaints are more than individual transactions. They should be strategic tools. They're kind of catalysts for change. And if something's gone wrong once, why did it go wrong? Is it isolated, or are there indicators that it could go wrong again unless something is changed? And therefore, it's not just putting it right for that person who brought the complaint, but it's putting it right to make sure that other residents don't experience that, and that extends fairness across the sector. And then the final bit is kind of raising local complaint standards, because ultimately someone's ambition is not to go to an ombudsman service, it's to get something sorted out. And actually that's in the interest of the landlord as well. Local standards and embedding a positive complaint culture locally is also key. And I think that's kind of us in a nutshell. I hope overall though that makes us kind of restorative service. I always think of ourselves as a kind of being restorative. Your point on gender equity is interesting, because what we know is we've got a majority of households in social housing who are led by women. It's about 57%, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm really struck that if you look at recent lettings, households can be like 71% of households will be led by a woman. And that's really reflected in our casework and reflected in some of the issues that we see. And I think there's a lot, I think, for landlords to reflect on from the kind of who are bringing complaints, what they're seeing in complaints, and also for us as an ombudsman service in the way that complaint handling works to respond to that. And that's, when you kindly ask me to join the podcast, that's a real reflection point for me. It's kind of actually, what does that mean in the way in which complaint handling works in social housing?
Yeah, and that's really something that I'm committed to putting a spotlight on through my campaign, because I think it's all about the questions that were asked, isn't it, and what they prompt us to then think about. Yeah. Through my See Her campaign, I'm really committed to putting this spotlight on the fact that actually our female tenants might be experiencing things differently, and therefore, how do we respond to that? How do we need to lean into that and understand, what's going on there? And I think I'm not the only one doing this. I don't know if you were at Housing Manchester in 2025, this year, but Daniel Hewitt was there, the renowned journalist who did all that work around exposing damp and mould in the sector. And something that he said that really struck me, and I'm going to paraphrase because I'm terrible at remembering things word for word, but the notion of it was, why did it take a white man, so himself, the journalist, to say something that black female tenants had been saying for ages for them to be listened to? And I really like when I sort of heard him say that, I was just like whooping, like, yes, this is the point, that it's not that women aren't saying or aren't saying that there's an issue here, but it just seems like their voices aren't often heard. So in the work that the Ombudsman does, but also like beyond that, how might the sort of barriers be removed? How could we sort of empower our women tenants and make sure that their voices are heard?
Yeah, I think Dan's comment I agree with you, is really very striking. And I think there's kind of two aspects to what he says in that comment. So the first is gender and the second is ethnic group. And I know your question's on the gender.
No, but it is both. There's intersectionality here, isn't there? You can't, you shouldn't shy away from that. It is a key factor.
I do agree. And so one of the things which we introduced at the Ombudsman Service was so that we didn't kind of, come across as unfortunately sometimes Ombudsman services can come across as kind of in a bit of an ivory tower, bit kind of hard to reach, austere, inaccessible. For the last few years, we've kind of done a roadshow, I suppose, around the country of open forums where typically hosted by a social landlord. So I think it's been a useful exercise for them as well as for us, and hopefully for their residents. And residents can come along and ask any questions of us as a service or about housing and their rights. And one of the things, and some of those sessions have been quite different, and we've done them all around the country, and and some of them have been quite popular. I mean, we've had like hundreds of people turn up at a session, so in a community hall, early evening, hundreds of people, and they're upset. They're really upset often at these sessions. And just looking at who is there in the room, I was struck by two things. One is, the proportion of women, high proportion of women.
Yeah.
And the second was probably Black Caribbean, Bangladeshi, but also ethnic groups. And it's very anecdotal, this to say, is very striking. And I remember one of these sessions, a woman said, who was Black Caribbean, said, "You're not doing the repairs." She's saying it to the landlord. I've had to complain to you. I've had to go to this ombudsman service. No one's listening to me, and you're not doing the repairs because of my ethnic background. And another woman shouted out in the audience, "Well, I get the same treatment. I'm white." Obviously, what we know is the majority of households are white. So
yeah.
And I would say in our casework, it would be really hard to say that there is a distortion or there is a bias, even an unconscious bias around gender or ethnic group. I think in terms of who's having to use the service, yes, there are trends that come out.
Yeah.
I'm always a bit cautious to go too far to say there's causation there, but there are some trends that come out. But I think in terms of outcomes, or or if there are any bias issues, it's hard to distinguish that or to determine that. What I would say, though, is that one of the things which is related to this is that we know that, or I increasingly see in the casework, that in our casework, and I've taken in this role a very active involvement in our casework and engaging with caseworkers on the investigation that they're doing and the decisions that we're making, is issues relating to children. And that's not to say that, because what we also know is that, that there can be a strong relationship here between single parent households. It's not exclusively female, but single parent households, and about 1 in 3 households in social housing, children being present. And what's really clear and often emotive, understandably very emotive, is the condition of the property, any outstanding repairs, and the concern about the impact on children. Impact on the whole household, but particularly children, and particularly where those children may have, say, a disability or a mental health need, or autism or something like that. And that comes across increasingly strongly, I think, in our casework. And I think the issue, I'll finish here, but I think the issue is too often in our casework, sometimes landlords handle this really effectively, and we see that. But too often, reoccurringly, what we see is that the resident is telling the landlord this. A mother is saying to the landlord, I'm worried about my baby. I'm worried about the impact on my child's attendance at school. I'm worried about what the GP's telling me. And it's not recorded, and it's not responded to. So the information is there. The information is available to the landlord. But but frequently what we'll see in our, what you'll see in our investigation reports is we'll say, this is the circumstances of the household. The landlord recorded, none of these things in relation to that household. And so there is something about overcoming this, not just looking at the property, but looking at who's living in the property and understanding not just the home, but understanding who lives in the home and connecting the circumstances of the household with the condition of the property. And that connection is sometimes missing, too often missing in our casework.
That really sort of resonates with me. One of the sort of examples that I've been using as part of the campaign to sort of get people to understand what I'm talking about here is around a resident who she received a letter to say that her gas was going to be capped because the landlord couldn't get in to do the gas servicing of her boiler. And it wasn't for not trying. They kept on sending her appointments to come and do her service, but she worked outside of the house. She was a single mum, worked 9 to 5 outside of the house, so she didn't work from home. She had 2 young children as well to factor in, and so she was taking these days annual leave to stay in so that somebody could come in to service her boiler, and they weren't turning up. So she just said, I'm really sorry, but I can't take any more time off to do this. It would be really helpful if I could choose when my appointment is, and that you would just come at that time. And could that appointment maybe be, on a weekend when I know I'm going to be in on a Saturday morning or what have you? And the answer was no. And all she was getting was these threatening letters to say, if you don't let us, gain access to your property. And it was just the computer said no. It was an automated system. And I think it's that thing, you've got to be careful, like what gets measured gets done. And the housing organisation was trying to have that duty of care around safety, right? Like their compliance target was around number of completions, of percentage completions of gas servicing. And so they were trying to do the right thing, but in the wrong way, and not thinking about the person who lives in that home, that person who you're trying to provide a safe home for, and what might work for them. And obviously they spent a lot of time and money on wasted appointments and all of that, when actually just thinking about her situation might improve the process. And actually a good news story there, because they did invest in the process, I understand, and now it's much more sort of self-serve in terms of booking appointments and that type of thing. So it really strikes me what you say there about thinking about who is it that lives in the home and what do they need.
I so agree with this. And I think that point around access has really come into sharp relief in the last few years. Something we've heard from landlords, but also something increasingly we've also heard from residents. And, and where, as an ombudsman service, you can sort of sit there and you can hear, well, look, you've got a resident who clearly seems to want something sorted out in the property. They're going to time and trouble to sort this out. You've got a landlord with the obligations who's saying, well, we're trying to sort it out. And there's this disconnect. Well, why is there this disconnect? And I'd say 6 years ago when I started the service, we had a lower volume of cases. Now we get a contact every 25 seconds. We register a new case every 3 minutes.
Wow.
Years ago that just wasn't the case. And the average age of who we'd hear from was much higher. And the sort of explosion of casework coming to us has brought down that average age and broaden the circumstances. And as you say, if you go back to the fact that look, if you've got a single parent household, for example, or you've got to pay that, it may not necessarily be led by a woman, but more often than not, it probably will be. And what you're seeing is, is it accounting for the school run? Is it accounting for working patterns? Instead, these kind of assumptions that, it may be someone who's over 65 or something who's raised a complaint, that's not the reality of what we're seeing in our casework. And I think that's coming across really strongly. And as you say, it's exposing for some landlords how they're even like the brilliant basics that you would expect around booking appointments are outdated and are not reflective of consumer experiences elsewhere. And this is the challenge for the sector is consumers have touch points with a range of different services, and and the social housing sector's got to keep up with that. And in some ways, there's a strong argument for housing management and maintenance to go far ahead of it as well.
Yeah. So you've picked up on something that a couple of times that I just wanted to sort of go a bit deeper on, which is around this thing around that 57% or so of our tenants, lead tenants, are female. So I'm a bit of a geek, Richard, and I like a good freedom of information request. I'm one of those annoying people who give your colleagues lots of work to do. But I do want to the Ombudsman around the simple question of, well, I thought it was a simple question, do women complain about their landlord in higher sort of proportion than men? I wanted to know if women were more peed off with their landlords than men. And actually, I have to say a massive well done to the officer who dealt with the request. They were brilliant. They asked me, what is it exactly you want to know? And had gone into loads of detail, and it's been so helpful. But what the data told us was, yes, proportionately, women are more likely to complain about their landlords than men. So beyond that 57% that you would expect to see if it was even. So when I've been talking about this stat as part of my complaint, the next question people ask me is, well, what are they complaining about? So a real curiosity around, like, well, there's just certain things that the sector is maybe just getting wrong, which has a bigger impact on women. So I know you mentioned things there about issues relating to condition of the home and relating to children and things like that. But are there sort of any trends, any typical things that we're seeing women raising, about their social landlords?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think I'm always interested in the FOIs that we receive, because I think it's, inevitably it's informed, like yourself, informed by your own experience, your own knowledge. And actually that, and I'm curious, is there something here that, we should be reflecting on? So I always find, and this was absolutely one of those FOIs that, I think is thought-provoking. So when we ask people for EDI data, not everyone will say,
of course.
So with that caveat, very important caveat in place. I would say that it is driven by property condition.
Mm.
And within that, it is driven by damp and mould. I also strongly suspect what will emerge over the next few years is the challenge around, if you like, the current decent home standard and the potential reformed decent home standard.
Yeah.
Because what we see is that playoff between responsive repairs and major works, and that will, and there's issues like windows, for example, and window maintenance that have come into sharp relief recently. But so property condition, damp and mould, but I think other issues will emerge like windows and other components, if you like, core components in years to come. What we see less of from women, but I wouldn't, in terms of complaints, looking at this, is around areas like estate management. But I wouldn't necessarily read a huge amount into that. Instead, I'd focus on the fact it's property condition, which again, I think comes back to the fact that as a repair is more than a job. This is someone's environment and their household's environment, and that strong correlation also with health, any disabilities, and any children present.
Yeah. That's really insightful, isn't it? And I think when you say it, it sort of just makes total sense, doesn't it? Of course, mums want homes that their children are safe in and can thrive in. But yes, I think sometimes as a sector, we don't see it that way around, and I think it's good to take a step back and reflect on that. I'm going to take us down a different alley now, if that's all right, just because this is sort of the Here Come the Boys podcast, and I'm really keen to delve into this question of male allyship. So, got loads of male colleagues working in the housing sector, both frontline in the housing sector and also more likely in leadership positions, but we're not going down that rabbit hole. But what does male allyship sort of look like to you? What do you think, in the sector, what does good male allyship look like? And I suppose, do you have any examples of anybody who you think might be leading the way in this space?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And this is very much an answer informed also by working in an ombudsman sector where, within our organisation, 68% of our colleagues would identify as a woman. And many ombudsmen are, it's not helpful, it is apparently a gender neutral term, but many ombudsmen are women. It's very, and from that perspective, that experience into the housing sector, I mean, certainly over the period that I've been involved in housing, I've seen a real change in leadership, and at the forefront here, and the emergence of really, at different levels, the emergence of more prominent, visible female leaders, which has always been there, but I think it must have accelerated. It feels to me like it's accelerated. I think one of the issues around allyship is firstly a kind of advocacy role, and being a visibility of it as a male working within a sector is being open, visible, recognising it, and an advocate around it and around talking about the issues. I think there's then also has to depend if you're in a position, a decision-making position, or a lead or a leadership position. There has to be something around how then you ensure that the shadow of the leader and that tone is reflective within the organisation, so that there can be a coherent, open, direct conversation within an organisation, and you have that culture. And then you do need to look at your and this will be individual to each organisation, but you do need to then look at your policies, how your people strategy works, and so on, to make sure that it's inclusive and recognises some of the barriers that will exist. In terms of good practice, and I think one area there'll be, you careful. I should be careful not to talk about either the sector in a homogenous way or indeed individual landlord in a homogenous way. But we will know, certainly in the past, you would look at the development arm, if there were one, and maybe say that of a social animal, so maybe that wasn't embracing kind of diversity perhaps as other areas. Repairs and maintenance, there can be some challenges there, and I think there's some, and I've seen that in our casework. I mean, we highlighted, for example, in our last Spotlight report, which was called Repairing Trust, we
Yes.
highlighted how, and this touches on appointments that we were talking about and access earlier, how a male operative attended without a prearranged appointment, a women's refuge,
Mm.
and just thinking about your workforce and your customer base. And so the promotion of women in trades, I think, is probably something really the sector could do more on. But there has been some really good practice there. And for example, Live West, have thought about apprenticeships there and expansion of
Yes.
that. So I think there is the organisational thing, then there are specific service areas, and there are specific things, particularly I think women in trades, which there's been some good stuff on, could be more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's like if you follow that thread from what we've been saying around, well, actually, if it is condition of property and it is repairs that women seem most dissatisfied about, and they're maybe traditionally departments of our organisations that are dominated by men in trades, then you follow that thread and it's maybe, well, is that where we need to focus on in terms of our understanding and also allyship? And I think that point you make about organisational culture, leadership is so key in this, isn't it? I used to work with a head of repairs, and he probably did more for women and female tenants than I've ever known anybody in any organisation do, because he just got it. And so he would challenge if there was ever sort of sexist talk amongst people on the tools, and he would really make sure that the language that was being used was inclusive, and when it came to complaints, was really curious about what's underneath this, and is it just that we've gone in there with our job in mind, the task that we need to complete, but haven't necessarily been curious about what's going on here, and how just me being in this environment, how might it be making this tenant feel, and that type of thing. So I think I agree. I think we have moved on a long way. It's not just that it's just men who work in repairs and development now. We've got some amazing women. So key, I think, if you're a leader in those traditionally male departments, to be, have this at the forefront of your mind, and because I think that's what sort of engenders that change. It's around it is around leadership, isn't it?
Totally. And I think that's such an important point about calling out, or at least addressing, where you see, sexism or behaviours which aren't appropriate. I've been struck sometimes, not often, but sometimes we see that directly in our casework. You can see how culturally the organisation went into defensive mode rather than reflective mode, and as a result, kind of, didn't challenge behaviours which were, inappropriate towards, female tenant, by a male operative. And as you say, men should feel empowered in those positions to be able to rank and direct about that stuff.
Absolutely. I don't know if you ever have time to look at the work that we do at Wish. We do a survey every year, and it's focused mostly on women working in the sector. So it's not about tenants, but it's about the experiences of our female colleagues. And a stubborn statistic that we seem to be really struggling to drive down is this one around sexism. So we ask every year, in the past 12 months, have you experienced sexism in the workplace? And every year, the yes answer is around 20 to 25%. So this year it was 23% of women have said in the last 12 months they've experienced sexism in their workplace. And it infuriates me.
Yeah.
especially because of that. I say that I've said this many times, but if that was racism, we would be having a riot, right? Like, we'd be like, what? 23% of people have said they experienced racism. Not that I don't think that is massively important. It definitely is. And I'd love to see the stats on that. But why are we not having a riot? Because, in this day and age, that's a fifth of our female workforce are saying that. But also that must then permeate through to our tenant experiences, because it wouldn't just be within a workplace and not within, how we deliver services and things. So it's a stat I'm really keen to get out there, just to say, actually, this isn't all right in 2025, that 23% of women in our workplaces are saying they're experiencing sexism. So, yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's bullying, and you've got the experience of the individuals as well as the people who may have witnessed that. Depending on the circumstances, may have witnessed that. So that is absolutely right to focus on that.
So we've had a wonderful chat, and I think we could chat for ages, couldn't we? But I never let our guests leave without asking our famous question. So I've left a bit of time to get into this one with you. So yes, this question is called the If I Had One Wish. This podcast is called the If I Had One Wish podcast. So if you had one wish for the social housing sector today, and looking forward, looking ahead, what would it be?
It would be around values, and I think living the organisation's values. I am invited by boards to. I mean, this has been something I've been kind of delighted to see happen. Is that boards getting involved in complaints, not just like kind of operational stuff driven down in the organisation, but really engaging on the role of complaints and the strategic role of complaints in their organisations. And so I get invited along pretty frequently, once a month, say, to talk to a different board. And when it's in person, I'm given a cup of tea. It's very kind. Given
and biscuits, I hope.
Maybe. And the mug, it'll be a branded mug, and it will always, typically it'll have a value. At least, a handful of landlords now, there's the value has been on or the values, or one of the values has been on a mug. And, it's the sort of stuff, we listen, we put things right, we are open to ideas, where, we work together, it's all of that stuff that you'll see. And complaints are a really good indicator of your culture and whether you're living your values. And those values are more than kind of, statements to stick on a mug. They are things that are living and breathing. And there are really practical ways, I think, that landlords can, use complaints to demonstrate and test whether they're living their values. And one is communication. When it comes back where we started in this conversation, often the complaints being raised by residents, and is they feel that they're not being heard, it's not being treated seriously, they're not sure what's happening, they've got an uncertainty. Won't always be the case. If we see where we find that something hasn't gone wrong, that will be reflective of really crisp, clear, confident communication. Where it has gone wrong, it's confused, there's gaps, there's miscommunication, it's not timely, the tone might be wrong, it's not transparent communication, And that is a cultural thing, and that's a behaviour thing as well. Communication, it can be indicative of culture, it can be reflective of culture. And I see it, and it worries me, this. I see it sometimes where the resident may have experienced domestic abuse, and, and the communication just is inadequate, not listening to that resident. Again, typically that will be a female resident raising it, a woman raising it, not listening to that resident, not necessarily doing the right signposting, not necessarily keeping them updated in communication, not necessarily working with other bodies. So that's it. Communication with other stakeholders, communication internally. Yeah. So I think it's values, and then thinking about how communication reflects those values, and that is my wish.
Yeah, brilliant. I think often organisations can treat their values like a destination, like it's somewhere that we've arrived at, And the organisations that I think live their values out well are the ones who treat them like a journey. So if a value is communication, instead of saying we listen, maybe it should be we're always trying to listen. Or whether it's trust, we're trusted. It should be we're always working towards being trusted, because there'll always be parts of the organisation where you live these values so well. You've worked on it for years. You've got an amazing team under a fantastic leader, and it's just through the lifeblood of that department. And then walk 50 metres to the other department and it's not. There's work to be done there. And I think if we had that mindset around our values being statements that prompt us along our journey, then I think we would work more on it, because, I think there's always this thing of just like this proclamation statements, and it's almost like we've arrived. And it's like, actually, no, you never arrive at those values, because they'll look different in different circumstances, and different teams and different legislation will come in and you'll have to change. I think that way of doing it might prompt us to just live them out a bit better than just, as you say, words on a page, maybe.
Totally. And they can be aspirational, but also keep you focused on your core purpose.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Richard, it has been so insightful. I'm so grateful for you coming on our podcast and sharing your honesty and your insights. So thank you for that.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Crystal.
Super. Okay, so for everybody who's listened, men and women, I hope you've been really inspired, and I hope we've helped you to consider how maybe you could sort of actively listen to what your tenants are saying, to speak up, to challenge. And if you're a man, how you could maybe be a good ally or advocate for your female colleagues and tenants. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Crystal Hicks, and this has been the If I Had One Wish podcast. Until next time. Thank you everyone for listening to the If I Had One Wish podcast. Next time, we'll be talking to another inspirational female from the housing sector, who will be sharing her career story on what she's learned along the way. And of course, we'll be asking again the big question. If she had one wish, what would it be and why? See you next time.